Imagine standing on a dock in Lisbon in 1500. The ships are being loaded. The maps are rough, the ocean is vast, and the men climbing aboard believe, genuinely believe, that they are carrying something precious with them. Christianity, civilization, order, progress. They are not in their own minds predators. They are pioneers. Now imagine standing in the Congo in 1900, a rubber plantation. A Congolese man has not met his quota. His hand has been cut off as punishment. A practice so routine under King Leopold II of Belgium that baskets of severed hands were collected as administrative proof of discipline. Somewhere between 10 and 15 million people died in the Congo Free State during Leopold's reign. Not in war, in a system. These two images, the dock in Lisbon and the plantation in the Congo, sit at the heart of one of the most consequential and still unresolved debates in human history. Was colonialism, whatever its horrors, also a vehicle for progress? Or was it, at its core, nothing more than organized theft dressed in the language of civilization? Today, we are going to sit with that question seriously, philosophically, historically, and without flinching, through the minds of three extraordinary thinkers: John Stuart Mill, the British liberal who defended empire; Karl Marx, who condemned capitalism but complicated the colonial question more than people realize; and Frantz Fanon, the Martinican psychiatrist and revolutionary who looked colonialism in the face and described what it did to the human soul. This is not a comfortable conversation, but it is a necessary one. Let us begin. Part 1: John Stuart Mill and the Civilizing Mission, the Torch of Progress. John Stuart Mill was born in London in 1806, the son of James Mill, himself a senior official of the British East India Company, and a man who wrote a celebrated history of India without ever visiting the country or learning an Indian language. The apple, in some respects, did not fall far from the tree. John Stuart Mill worked for the East India Company for 35 years. He was, by any measure, one of the finest minds of the 19th century. The author of On Liberty, the great defender of free speech and individual rights. The philosopher who gave us the most sophisticated version of utilitarianism. He believed with evident sincerity in human progress, in reason, in the expansion of freedom, and he believed in the British Empire. In his essay On Liberty, published in 1859, Mill writes that his principles apply to human beings in the maturity of their faculties, and then adds, almost as an aside, that he is not speaking of those peoples who are still in their nonage, their infancy. Despotism, he says, is a legitimate mode of government when dealing with barbarians, provided that the end in view is their improvement. This is the philosophical core of what historians call the civilizing mission. The idea that European colonial power was justified because it was, in the long run, beneficial to those it conquered. Britain bringing railways to India, France bringing la mission civilisatrice to Algeria and West Africa, Spain and Portugal bringing Christianity in the Spanish language to the Americas, Belgium, grotesquely, claiming to bring order and commerce to the Congo. The language was always the same: civilization, progress, science, modernity. The colonizer was always the adult, the colonized always the child. The relationship was always framed as temporary, a tutelage that would eventually end when the colonized had sufficiently matured. Mill genuinely believed this, and his belief was not unique to him. It was, in the 19th century, the mainstream position of European liberalism, shared by politicians, philosophers, missionaries, and administrators from London to Paris to Lisbon. The empire was not merely a system of extraction, it was, in their minds, a moral project. But let us ask the question Mill never sufficiently asked: who decides when a people has reached maturity? The answer, of course, is the colonizer. The British decided when Indians were ready for self-governance, and kept deciding they were not for nearly 2 centuries. The French decided that Algerians required French civilization, and remained in Algeria for 132 years, during which time the indigenous population was systematically dispossessed, impoverished, and subjected to what the historian Alexis de Tocqueville, another liberal, called the deliberate destruction of a society. There is a deeper problem in Mill's position, one that his own philosophy of liberty should have forced him to see. If freedom is the highest human good, If the development of individual character and autonomous reason is what gives life its value, then a system which, by its very structure, denies an entire people the exercise of self-determination is not a path toward liberty. It is its negation. The civilizing mission was, at its philosophical foundation, a contradiction in terms. Mill saw the torch. He did not see what it was burning. Part 2. Karl Marx and the Contradictions of Capital, the Violence Beneath the Progress. Karl Marx was born in Trier, in the German Rhineland, in 1818, just 12 years after Mill. He never worked for a colonial company. He spent much of his life in poverty in London, in a cramped flat in Soho, writing in the British Museum reading room, watching the machinery of British capitalism from the outside. And yet Marx's relationship to colonialism is one of the most debated and, frankly, one of the most uncomfortable topics in Marx's scholarship. Because Marx did not straightforwardly condemn colonialism, at least not always. In a series of articles written for the New York Tribune in 1853, Marx reflected on the British presence in India. He wrote that British rule was causing enormous suffering, the destruction of traditional industries, the collapse of village communities, the brutal extraction of wealth. He was clear about that. But he also wrote, and this is the passage that has troubled readers ever since, that whatever the intentions of the British, the historical effect of their presence might be to drag India into modernity, to break apart a social structure he considered stagnant and oppressive, and to lay the material foundations for a future Indian revolution. This is not the same as Mill's argument. Marx was not defending colonialism morally. He despised the British ruling class and had no illusions about their motives. But he shared with his century a certain faith in historical progress, a belief that history moved through stages, that feudal societies needed to pass through capitalism before socialism was possible, and that this process, however violent, was in some sense inevitable and even necessary. It is a position he later significantly revised. By the 1870s, corresponding with Russian revolutionaries, Marx began to question whether non-European societies needed to follow the Western historical path at all. He wrote extensively about Ireland, and there his analysis was far clearer. British colonialism in Ireland was not progress. It was deliberate destruction designed to keep Ireland economically dependent and politically weak, because a prosperous Ireland would threaten British capitalism from within. What Marx gives us, even in his inconsistencies, is something Mill never provided: an economic anatomy of colonialism. In Capital, Marx describes what he calls primitive accumulation, the violent, often grotesque process by which capitalism first creates itself. The enclosure of common lands in England, the slave trade across the Atlantic, the plunder of the Americas by Spain and Portugal, the silver of Potosi, the gold of the Aztec and Inca empires, flooding into Europe and funding the very commercial revolution that would be called the birth of modernity. Marx understood that the Industrial Revolution in Britain was not a spontaneous flowering of British ingenuity. It was built, in significant part, on the profits of empire, on the cotton picked by enslaved people in the American South, processed in Lancashire mills, sold to markets in Asia that had been prized open by force. The wealth of nations, to use Adam Smith's phrase, was not created in a vacuum, it was extracted. This is the indispensable contribution of the Marxist tradition to the debate on colonialism. The insistence that progress for some requires asking who paid for it. The railways mills celebrated in India were built by Indian labor, financed by Indian taxation, and their primary function was to move British goods into Indian markets and Indian raw materials out. India did not develop because of the British Empire. India was, as the economic historian Utsa Patnaik has calculated, drained of approximately $45 trillion over the course of British rule, a figure that goes some way toward explaining why one of the world's oldest and richest civilizations emerged from colonialism in 1947 with a literacy rate of 12% and a life expectancy of 32 years. Progress, Marx would say, is a real thing, but it is not evenly distributed. And when it is achieved through the systematic impoverishment of others, The word progress deserves to be placed in very careful quotation marks. Part 3. Frantz Fanon and the Wretched of the Earth. What colonialism does to a human being. If Mill gave us the colonizer's philosophy and Marx gave us the colonizer's economics, Frantz Fanon gave us something that neither could, the colonized person's psychology, and nothing in this conversation is more important. Frantz Fanon was born in 1925 in Martinique, then, as now, a French overseas territory in the Caribbean. He grew up speaking French, educated in the French tradition, believing, as French Martinicans were encouraged to believe, that he was essentially French, a citizen of the Republic, heir to Voltaire and Hugo, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He served in the Free French forces during the Second World War. He trained as a psychiatrist in Lyon, and then, working in a French colonial hospital in Algeria during the Algerian War of Independence, he encountered something that his French education had not prepared him for: the systematic, structured psychological destruction of an entire people. His first major work, Black Skin, White Masks, published in 1952, is one of the most extraordinary documents in modern intellectual history. It is part philosophy, part psychoanalysis, part autobiography, and its central argument is this: colonialism does not merely exploit the body of the colonized, it colonizes the mind. Fanon describes what happens when a child grows up in a world where every image of beauty, intelligence, authority, and civilization is white, and every image of savagery, ignorance, and inferiority is black. The colonized person internalizes the colonizer's gaze. They learn to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressor, and what they see, they are taught to be ashamed of. Language itself becomes a weapon. To speak French, to speak Portuguese, to speak the language of the colonizer fluently and elegantly is to ascend. To speak one's own language, to retain one's own culture, is to remain inferior. This is what Fanon means by the colonization of consciousness, and it is, he argues, one of the most devastating forms of violence ever inflicted on human beings, because it is invisible, because it works from the inside, and because it is extraordinarily difficult to undo. In his later and more radical work, The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961, with a preface by Jean-Paul Sartre, Fanon turns from psychology to politics. He is writing now as a committed member of the Algerian National Liberation Front, and his argument is uncompromising. Colonial violence cannot be answered with petitions and polite requests. It can only be answered with counter-violence. The colonized must, in the act of resisting, reclaim not only their land, but their humanity, because colonialism has stolen both. This is the part of Fanon that many readers find most troubling, and it is worth sitting with that discomfort rather than dismissing it. Fanon is not celebrating violence for its own sake. He is making a precise psychological claim that a person who has been told their entire life that they are subhuman, that their culture is worthless, that their very existence is an inconvenience to civilization, that person cannot heal simply by being told they are now free. The psychological wound is too deep. The liberation must be active. The reclamation of selfhood requires an active will that confronts power directly. Fanon died of leukemia in 1961 at the age of 36, just months before Algerian independence. He did not live to see whether his vision of a decolonized humanity could be realized, but his questions remain. They have not gone away. They haunt us still. In every conversation about development aid, in every debate about immigration, in every museum in London or Paris or Brussels that displays the looted art of Africa and Asia, in every former colony that inherited borders drawn by European diplomats who had never set foot on the soil they were dividing. Part 4, bringing the threads together. What does philosophy owe history? So here we stand, having listened to Mill, Marx, and Fanon. What can we say? Mill was not a stupid man, or even by the standards of his own time, an unusually cruel one. He was a product of a world that had constructed an elaborate philosophical architecture to justify what it was doing, and he helped to build that architecture. The language of civilization and progress was not mere propaganda. The people who used it believed it. That is, in some ways, the most disturbing fact of all. Marx cracked that architecture open by asking the question it most wanted to avoid: who benefits and who pays? He showed that the progress of European modernity was not a gift to the world but a transaction, one in which one party set the terms and the other had no choice but to accept them. Fanon took us somewhere neither Mill nor Marx fully went, into the interior of the human being who lives under that system. He showed us what it costs, not in statistics, but in selfhood, in the ability to look in a mirror and recognize yourself as fully human. Together, these three thinkers give us something like a complete picture, or at least a more honest one. Colonialism was not simply evil men doing evil things. It was a system, philosophical, economic, psychological, that operated across centuries, across continents, sustained by some of the most sophisticated minds of the modern era. And the question it leaves us with is not only historical, it is present tense. The wealth generated by colonial extraction did not disappear when the flags came down. The psychological structures that colonialism built, in both the formerly colonized and the formerly colonizing, did not dissolve with independence. The borders drawn by European powers in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia continue to shape conflicts today. The museums of Europe still house objects taken without consent. Philosophy at its best does not let us look away. It insists that we follow the argument wherever it leads, even when, especially when, it leads to uncomfortable places. Mill followed the argument and stopped too soon. Marx followed it further, but not far enough. Fanon followed it all the way to the wound. Perhaps what we owe history, what intellectual honesty demands, is the willingness to look at the wound clearly, without flinching, and to ask what healing would actually require. Not as an abstraction, not as a footnote in a philosophy textbook, but as a real question for the real world that we are still living in. Thank you for staying with this conversation. These are not easy ideas, but they are important ones. If something here has unsettled you or challenged you or made you want to push back, good. That is exactly what philosophy is supposed to do. If you found this video useful, please subscribe to the channel and suggest it to others. Feel free to comment on this video and ask any questions you want about the video. The works we have drawn on today are listed in full in the description below. I would encourage you to read them, not because they will give you comfortable answers, but because they will give you better questions. Until next time.